True, scary, deep woods stories. I burned the forest to escape, but it followed me into my dreams. No one in the town of Briar Ridge had dared enter Black Hollow Forest in over 20 years. Years. Not since the last group of campers went missing without a trace, leaving behind only scattered supplies and a set of footprints that ended in the middle of an untouched clearing. Locals said the forest whispered at night, that it called to you with the voices of those who never came back. When 24-year-old Dylan Mercer decided to film a deep woods documentary about America's most terrifying untouched forests, he dismissed the rumors as small-town paranoia. He brought his camera gear, drone, 3 GoPros, and 2 friends, Rachel, his fearless ex-girlfriend and co-host, and Manny, their tech-savvy cameraman. The plan was simple: hike into Black Hollow, film interviews with nearby locals, spend 3 nights at the heart of the forest, and get out. What they didn't realize was that the forest had been waiting. On day 1, things felt normal. Too normal. They filmed an opening shot at the forest mouth, joking about ghost stories and bear attacks. The trail they followed was narrow and barely visible, more like a forgotten animal path than a hiking route. The deeper they went, the quieter it got. Birds stopped chirping, even insects vanished. By nightfall, they reached an old ranger's shack from the 1960s, now a ruin with moss-covered walls and broken window frames. Manny set up trail cams. Rachel lit a fire. Dylan recorded a monologue, feeling a strange heaviness in his chest as the darkness surrounded them. Around 3 a.m., Rachel shook Dylan awake, whispering that someone, or something, was walking just outside the campsite. Dylan grabbed a flashlight, but when he turned it on, the beam flickered, then died. Manny's camera had captured it, a shape standing still just beyond the trees, not moving, not breathing. The next morning, they found footprints circling the campsite, barefoot, human-sized, and deep. But what chilled them most was that they all led inward. None led out. Dylan wanted to pack up and leave, but Rachel insisted on pressing forward. "That's what we're here for," she said. "If we run now, we'll never know the truth." They hiked deeper on day 2, toward what locals called the Heart Tree, a massive oak in the center of the forest, rumored to have grown over the bodies of missing hikers. As they approached, the GPS started glitching. The compass spun uselessly. The air grew thick, as if the forest were breathing. They set up camp beneath a canopy so dense it swallowed the sun. That night, the whispering began. Faint at first, like wind, then clearer. Words, names, Dylan's, Rachel's, Manny's. They thought it was a prank, one of them messing with the others. But when Manny played back the audio from the trail cams, the whispers were already there hours before they arrived. On day 3, they woke to find Rachel missing. Her sleeping bag was still zipped, her boots by the fire, her camera lying in the grass with the lens shattered inward. Manny found a set of fresh footprints leading away from the camp, barefoot again, but this time they weren't human. The toes were too long, the arch was wrong. The skin impression looked wet. They followed the prints until they vanished at a patch of ground where the leaves hadn't been disturbed. Just vanished. That night, Dylan dreamt of the heart tree, its roots writhing like snakes, whispering Rachel's name over and over. He woke to find Manny standing inches from the tree, eyes rolled back, whispering something in a language Dylan didn't understand. When he touched Manny's shoulder, Manny collapsed, screaming. His ears were bleeding. The camera footage showed nothing. No movement. Just Manny standing still, lips moving, shadows bending toward him. On the morning of day 4, Dylan was alone. Manny had vanished. His gear was untouched, but his clothes were laid out in a perfect circle around the dying fire, as if he'd taken them off slowly and deliberately before walking into the woods naked. Dylan ran. The trail was gone. His compass spun again. Every direction looked the same. He screamed their names until his voice cracked. That night, the whispers turned into screams. They weren't random. They were Rachel and Manny calling for help, then begging him to stop looking. The trees seemed to lean closer. The shadows clung longer. When he tried to sleep, something breathed against his ear and said, "You're next." On the final morning, Dylan stumbled upon the clearing where the last campers had vanished 20 years ago. The same one with the single set of footprints. Except now, there were dozens, all barefoot, all walking in circles. In the center was a camera, his own, but he didn't remember dropping it. When he looked through the viewfinder, it played footage of himself sleeping, film from above. It had been recording all night, but no one had held it. No drones, no tripods, just hovering, watching. He dropped it and ran until he saw light, sunlight, and burst out of the trees into the backlot of a gas station 5 miles from Briar Ridge. Covered in scratches, dirt, and dried blood, he screamed for help until someone called the sheriff. When they returned to search for Rachel and Manny, there was nothing. No gear, no tracks, not even the shack remained, as if the forest had swallowed everything. Dylan uploaded the footage he salvaged. Blurry, strange, whisper-filled clips that cut off at random. They went viral. People debated if it was real or staged. He never spoke of it again. But late at night, he hears them, Rachel and Manny, whispering from the trees behind his apartment, calling his name, waiting, because no one really escapes Black Hollow. Not forever. 2 weeks had passed since Dylan escaped Black Hollow Forest, but the nightmares hadn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the roots twisting like tendrils around Manny's legs, dragging Rachel backward into the shadows, heard their voices whispering, not in fear, but in warning. His therapist said it was survivor's guilt. His online followers called him a hoaxer, and the local police had closed the case citing lack of evidence and consent to search private land. But Dylan knew what he'd seen, what he'd heard, what he'd felt burrowing into the back of his skull during that last night. At first, he tried to return to normal life, editing freelance footage, avoiding interviews, deleting emails from podcast hosts and documentary producers begging for exclusive rights. But on the 17th night, something changed. His bedroom plants died overnight, their roots blackened and twisted. His tap water turned brown, and in the middle of the night, he awoke to find dirt on his sheets. Wet soil, fresh, like someone had walked barefoot across his bed. But his door was locked, his window sealed. The next morning, a package arrived without a return address. Inside was a tape recorder, an old one, dusty and partially broken. There was a note, no signature, just, "Play this alone. Do not stop it. Do not leave the room." Against his better judgment, Dylan locked the door, shut the blinds, and hit play. For a moment, static. Then a voice, Rachel's, whispering frantically, "Dylan, it's not the forest. It's beneath it. It lives in the roots. Don't let it follow you. Don't let it anchor. Burn everything that remembers, or it'll grow." Then silence. No timestamp. No signs of audio edits. Just Rachel's voice, desperate, broken, and unmistakably real. Dylan vomited into his bathroom sink. That night, he tried to burn the recorder. It wouldn't light. Not even with gasoline. It melted a bit, hissed like steam escaping from under bark, and then reformed, whole again. Dylan called Manny's brother, Mateo, who hadn't believed him when he'd first called after the disappearance. This time Dylan sent him the tape. Mateo, a skeptic turned frantic, called back an hour later whispering fast in Spanish, saying he'd heard his own voice on the tape. Whispers of things he'd never told anyone. That same night, Mateo disappeared. The police found his car running in his driveway. Driver's door wide open, phone in the passenger seat still recording a voicemail he never finished. The last few seconds, the sound of leaves crunching, footsteps, then whispering, then static. Dylan broke. He bought a map and marked every strange disappearance within 30 miles of Black Hollow. There were more than 30 cases over 50 years. Hikers, hunters, campers, photographers. Most vanished without a trace. The few bodies recovered had one thing in common. Roots. Black, thorny roots entwined through their rib cages or skulls, always seemingly grown after death. Some weren't even classified as homicides. Environmental anomaly, one coroner report said. But Dylan remembered the way the roots moved. Alive. Searching. Dylan reached out to one of the last surviving rangers who had worked the forest before it was closed off to the public. His name was Edgar Holt, 78 years old, living alone in a cabin 30 minutes south of the forest. At first, Edgar refused to talk. Then he agreed to a midnight meeting. "It only speaks at night," the old man said on the phone. Only then will you understand. When Dylan arrived, Edgar's cabin was lit by a dozen old oil lanterns, the air thick with sage and ash. Don't bring electronics in, Edgar warned. It listens through them now. Dylan left his phone in the car. Inside, Edgar poured whiskey into mugs made of bone. Actual bone. Human, Dylan suspected. Edgar began. Black Hollow ain't just cursed, he said. It's not haunted. It's fertile. It grows something that shouldn't grow. That place was once a burial ground before maps had names. Not human burial. Older. We built trails where we weren't supposed to. Drilled soil that should have stayed still. That tree in the center? That ain't a tree. It's an altar. It feeds. And it remembers. Dylan asked about the voices. Edgar went silent, then said, It doesn't just kill. It copies. It takes voices, memories. Sometimes it sends them out like seeds. You think you're dreaming of your friends? Those aren't dreams. Those are invitations. Dylan showed him the tape. Edgar didn't touch it, just stared. Burn your apartment. Burn your name. You were seen. If you ignore it, the roots will grow under your bed next. Then Edgar began to scream, not from fear, from pain. His nose bled, his eyes rolled back, and his skin turned pale. Roots burst from his chest like spikes. They writhed like tentacles, smacking lanterns and catching fire. Dylan ran, the whole cabin consumed in greenish flame, the air thick with the smell of rot and smoke. He drove aimlessly, every radio station replaced by static and whispers. One of the voices said his name over and over, but it wasn't Rachel. It was his own, begging, pleading, then screaming. He stayed at a roadside motel 3 towns away. At 2:37 a.m., a knock on the door. He didn't answer. Then a whisper. Right at the door. You forgot your roots. He stayed silent. The doorknob turned. Once. Twice. Then stopped. The next morning, the motel manager asked why Dylan had dragged mud all over the carpet. But Dylan hadn't left the bed all night. He checked his feet. Clean. Checked the carpet. Root prints. Not shoe prints. Not bare feet. Roots. Pressed in the shape of steps. That night, Dylan checked the camera from the forest again. Frame by frame. Just before the footage cut, he saw something new. In the reflection of the lens, his own face. But it wasn't holding the camera. It was watching from behind a tree, smiling. Dylan didn't sleep after seeing the reflection on the lens. He sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the frozen image of his own face smiling from behind a tree he remembered never approaching. There was no mistaking it. It was his face, down to the scar on his left eyebrow. But the eyes were wrong. Too dark, too deep. Like they weren't looking at the camera but through it, into him. The next morning, the motel clerk knocked on his door to ask when he'd be checking out. Dylan opened the door to respond, but the clerk's expression turned pale as he backed away slowly, muttering something about déjà vu. Thought you already left, the clerk whispered, before walking away stiffly, like he was fighting every muscle to keep from running. Dylan packed his things in silence. The floor under the bed had fresh dirt stains again. This time, though, they stretched from the window to the bathroom. He hadn't opened the window, hadn't even touched the curtains. And inside the bathroom mirror, the condensation from his morning shower had left words. You're blooming. He checked out and drove aimlessly for hours, passing through nameless towns and empty fields, until his gas tank forced him to stop. He pulled into a crumbling gas station in a town called Climber's Bend. Population unknown. No cars, no people. Just a single station with a flickering overhead light and an old man behind bulletproof glass reading a newspaper upside down. Dylan got out, pumped his gas, and approached the window to pay. The old man didn't look up. You ever bury anything out there? The man said, voice raspy and low. Dylan hesitated. What do you mean? Black Hollow. People go there to forget, to hide. They think if they plant their guilt deep enough, it won't grow. Dylan said nothing. The old man looked up finally, revealing milky white eyes and a scar running across his neck like someone had tried to silence him once. But guilt don't die, not in soil like that. It germinates. Dylan slid the money under the window without another word. As he turned to leave, the man called out, "They called to you because you're fertile, son. You carry the memory like pollen." Dylan didn't look back. He drove another 100 miles before stopping at a remote diner surrounded by pine trees. Inside, a single waitress stared at him as if she'd seen a ghost. He ordered coffee. She didn't ask what kind, just poured it, shaking slightly. When he lifted the cup, something was carved into the ceramic beneath. Sprout. He looked up, but the waitress was already walking into the kitchen, the door swinging behind her without a sound. The patrons around him, there were only three, sat motionless, not eating, not drinking, just watching him in silence. One of them, a woman with gray braids and a stitched scar across her lips, was mouthing something over and over. No sound, just movement. Dylan watched carefully, trying to decipher. The words formed slowly. "You're not you." He stood up, left a 20, and walked out without drinking the coffee. That night, Dylan drove back toward Black Hollow, not because he wanted to, but because he had nowhere else to go. The forest had started to pull him in long before the first hike, and now it was like a magnet dragging his soul backward. He set up a makeshift base camp in an abandoned ranger station he'd found on old maps, one that had been erased from current satellite views. The station was still standing, though barely. Inside were rotten bunk beds, broken radios, and a corkboard filled with missing posters from the 80s and 90s. All with one thing in common. Every victim was listed as having partial remains recovered. Yet in each photo, their eyes were blacked out with permanent marker. All except one, a boy named Ellis Grant, age 12, vanished in 1993. His photo was untouched, and someone had written in shaky red pen below it, "He saw it too." Dylan took the poster and placed it in his backpack. That night, he dreamt of the boy. But in the dream, Ellis wasn't a child. He was tall, thin, skin stretched tight over bone, and roots were growing from his hands into the earth like veins. "You came back," Ellis whispered in the dream. "That means it can flower." Dylan awoke choking. Something was in his throat. He staggered to the cracked sink in the station and coughed violently. What came out wasn't bile. It was moss. Wet, black-green moss that pulsed faintly before shriveling in the open air. He wrapped it in cloth and stored it in a jar. As the sun rose, Dylan ventured back into Black Hollow, following a path he remembered from that first trip. The one where Rachel screamed. The trees were still twisted, still blackened at the base. But there was no sound, not even birds. Just wind like breathing through teeth. Then ahead, the clearing, the altar tree, still standing, bigger, thicker, with a hollow at its base now wide enough for a man to crawl through. Dylan approached slowly, filming as he went, every part of his body screaming to turn back. But something inside pulsed with curiosity, with need. The roots shifted at his approach, not away from him, but toward him, welcoming, like they remembered him. Inside the hollow, he saw bones, dozens, maybe hundreds. Animal and human, wrapped in root tendrils like gifts. And in the center, an object glowed faintly. A small wooden totem, carved in his likeness, the face unmistakable. It had moss for hair, dirt for eyes. Dylan reached toward it, and the second his fingers brushed its surface, he heard screaming. Not from the forest, not from around him, from inside. Inside his chest, inside his mind, like 1,000 voices trapped behind his ribs, one louder than the rest. You can't pull it out once it's in. He dropped the totem, but it clung to his skin like sap. Roots burst from the carving and wrapped around his wrist, piercing skin, drinking deep. He fell to the ground convulsing, the roots crawling up his arm into his shoulder. His vision flickered. He saw flashes. Rachel's face melting into bark. Manny being pulled underground, screaming into dirt that swallowed sound. Edgar's body splitting open to birth vines. Then blackness. When he awoke, it was dusk. The totem gone. His wrist smooth. Clean. Except for one thing. A new scar. A perfect spiral etched into his skin. Like a seed. And when he looked up at the altar tree, something had changed. Carved into the bark, fresh and wet, were words in his handwriting. "Welcome home." The moment Dylan stood up, The forest had changed. Not visibly, not in the way trees grow or shadows fall, but in the way space folds when something ancient notices you. The air was thicker, resinous, like breathing through old honey and grave dirt. The wind no longer sounded natural. It clicked, popped, and scraped as though passing over brittle shells. The words "Welcome Home" still bled fresh on the altar tree behind him, but now they were mirrored on every tree he passed, each trunk etched with the same message in his handwriting, each version more distorted than the last. Some looked scratched in with claws, others burned in with fire. One bled a viscous black ichor that smelled like rot and iron. Dylan didn't run. He couldn't. His feet were responding slower, like each step required permission. He followed the path back to the ranger station, only to find it gone. Where once stood the dilapidated wooden structure, there now rose a perfect replica carved entirely from smooth black stone. Every detail was identical, down to the rusted hinges and broken window frames, but the material was obsidian, cold to the touch and warm beneath the surface, as if something inside pulsed with heat. He entered cautiously, flashlight trembling in his grip. Inside, the air was stale, unmoving. A table sat in the center now, one that hadn't been there before, and on it, spread open, was a leather-bound book. Not modern leather, something older, drier, cracked and flaking. The cover bore no title, just a spiral, the same spiral etched now into Dylan's wrist. When he touched the book, it opened itself. Not at the beginning, but at a page scrawled with frantic, looping script that seemed to shimmer between languages. The heading read, "The Germ Seed." Underneath were illustrations, horrible, detailed sketches of human figures split open like flowers, roots bursting from mouths, eyes, stomachs. One figure had his skin peeled back in 4 flaps, exposing lungs wrapped in vine. Another was impaled on a tree, body slowly merging with the bark, fingers becoming branches. And beside each image was a name: Edgar, Manny, Rachel, and the last name, Dylan Marin. His birth date was correct. His presumed death was listed as unplanted. A rustling sound echoed behind him. He spun around. Nothing. The flashlight flickered. A scratching began under his feet. He crouched down. The floor beneath the stone table was shifting. From between the cracks, tiny root-like tendrils were emerging, reaching upward, tasting the air. They stopped as his beam touched them. Then, like water poured through a funnel, they vanished. He slammed the book shut. The walls moaned, not creaked, moaned, like something in pain, or worse, something remembering its own suffering. He bolted out of the station and into the woods, only to find himself not in Black Hollow, but somewhere else. The forest was the same, yet not. Trees stood impossibly tall, their branches hanging upside down like chandeliers of dead moss and fungus. The sky was no longer sky, but a rolling canvas of pulsing veins, like he stood inside something living. And on the ground ahead, walking in unnatural jerks, was a deer. But it was wrong. Its legs were too long, bending backward, and its face was human. Not entirely, just enough. It watched him with Dylan's own eyes. A grotesque mimicry. It opened its mouth and spoke. "We are roots now. We wear your face so you'll listen." Dylan backed away, tripping over a stone that pulsed faintly with warmth. Behind him, other creatures emerged. Wolves with skeletal torsos, birds with human teeth, a child dragging her own head by its hair, all whispering, "Unplanted, unplanted. Take root, take root." Dylan ran, blindly. Branches scraped his face. Something slithered around his ankles, but he kept moving until the forest thinned. And then, a clearing. In the center stood a church, or what used to be one. Now overgrown, its steeple twisted, half sunken into the soil, its cross inverted and carved from bone. On the door, smeared in dark sap, the words, "The roots remember the Mass." He entered. The pews were filled, every seat occupied by a figure motionless and rotting. Faces covered with bark, hands sewn together with vine. all facing the pulpit where something stood. Not a person, not even a thing. A shape, tall, black, made of swaying limbs and dripping roots, wearing what looked like Dylan's old jacket. As he stepped forward, the heads of the congregation turned, one by one, their mouths opening in silence. No words, just gaping voids, inside of which more roots slithered, reaching. The figure at the pulpit spoke, not aloud, but into Dylan's head. You were chosen not because you were strong, but because you were empty. An empty vessel takes the seed best. Dylan screamed, but no sound escaped. His throat was filled again. Moss, crawling moss. He fell to his knees, choking, as the roots from the pews reached toward him. The floor cracked. The ground opened. He was pulled downward, downward into dirt and shadow and memory. Faces swirled around him. Rachel, Manny, his own mother crying at a funeral that hadn't happened yet. The roots wrapped tighter. Until, light. A flash. He was on the ground outside the church again, alone. The building was gone, the clearing empty, but his clothes were soaked with soil. His hands trembled as he checked his camera, somehow still strapped to his chest. The footage showed nothing, just static. But the audio, when he hit play, was his voice. But it wasn't him speaking. It was slower, deeper. I am planted now. I see what lies below. He looked at his wrist again. The spiral was gone, replaced by a knot of flesh, like something waiting to burst. He stood up, staggered back toward where he thought the highway might be. But the forest was infinite now, repeating, every tree the same, every path leading back to itself. And then he saw her. Rachel, just ahead, not moving, her back turned. He called to her. She turned, and she was smiling. But the smile wasn't hers. It was his. Again, the same smile from the photo. Too wide, too knowing. She pointed at his chest. He looked down. His jacket had split open. From the center of his sternum, something was growing. Slowly, green, pulsing, rooted. He touched it and screamed. Not because of pain, but because it responded. The thing growing inside him whispered back. Dylan ran, not because he believed he could escape, but because moving felt less like dying than standing still. The thing blooming from his chest pulsed in rhythm with something beneath the earth, a slow thumping like the heartbeat of a god buried deep beneath the forest. With every step, his breath grew shallower, his vision tinged red at the edges. Behind him, Rachel's not Rachel voice still echoed. Not through the trees, but inside his skull, like she had set up camp in his mind. Grow, Dylan. Grow for us. The trees seemed to lean in now, trunks tilting at impossible angles, branches brushing his face as though trying to taste his panic. The path twisted in on itself, no longer following any earthly logic. At one point, he ran downhill only to find himself climbing upward moments later. Gravity had rules here, but none he understood. The forest floor was breathing now, soft rises and falls under his boots like the heaving chest of a slumbering beast. And then he saw the sign, a wooden plank half buried in moss, crooked and splintered, but the word on it still clear. Camp Willowmere. It was a name he hadn't heard since childhood, a camp that had closed down decades ago after a mass disappearance of counselors and campers alike. He had read about it online. No bodies ever found, only the smell of burnt meat and iron when the authorities arrived. And now here it stood, untouched by time. Cabins still upright, canoes still leaned against racks, the lake shimmering in the moonlight like nothing ever happened. But Dylan knew better. He stepped into the main clearing and felt it immediately. The silence. Not the absence of sound, but the suffocation of it. Even the bugs refused to chirp here. The lake glowed faintly red beneath the surface, and the canoes had no reflections. He approached the mess hall, its windows intact, its doors swinging slowly as though inviting him in. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, black and white group shots of campers from the 50s and 60s. At first, they looked normal, but the longer he stared, the more wrong they became. Eyes too large, smiles too uniform, and in every photo, a tall figure stood in the background, always slightly out of focus, always wearing a ranger's uniform, always watching. Dylan turned away and saw that the tables had been rearranged into rows, like pews. At the front of the room, where a food counter should be, a pulpit had risen. Behind it, the same black stone spiral he'd seen in the ranger station was carved into the wood, bleeding sap that reeked of vinegar and copper. He stepped back, his heel crunching glass. He looked down and saw a pile of Polaroids scattered across the floor. Each one showed him, sleeping, walking, standing in the woods, all dated within the last 48 hours. Some angles were impossible. Overhead shots from treetops, close-ups of his face as he slept in places he couldn't remember being. One image showed him holding a flower with human teeth instead of petals. In another, he was kneeling before the spiral symbol carved into the forest floor, roots climbing up his legs like lovers. Dylan's hand trembled. He dropped the photos and turned, but the door was gone. The mess hall now had no exit, only walls, and the walls were changing, warping, expanding. The room stretched like a lung inflating, groaning with the effort. The tables melted into the floor, the photos on the walls liquefied into tar. And from the pulpit, something rose. It was him, or rather, a version of him. Taller, leaner, skin darkened by decay, eyes blank and glowing faintly green. The double opened its mouth, and out came a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. You are the germ seed. The soil accepts your sacrifice. Dylan backed away, his spine pressed to the wall. The double stepped down, leaving behind a trail of rot with each step. The floor beneath Dylan split open like lips parting. He fell, screamed, kept falling, until impact. Dirt, wet, warm, and alive. He had landed underground. Roots hung from the ceiling, swaying gently like seaweed in a current he couldn't feel. All around him were people, not buried, not corpses, people, faces peeking through the soil, eyes open, mouths twitching. One man sobbed, a girl giggled, a woman whispered a lullaby over and over. Their bodies were trapped beneath the dirt, only their heads free, like flowers not yet bloomed. Dylan tried to move, but the soil around his legs clenched. He sank a few inches deeper. Then he heard the humming. Software familiar. A tune his mother used to sing to him when he was sick. The melody floated from the far corner of the cavern, where a figure knelt in prayer before a massive tree root that pulsed like a beating heart. The figure turned. His mother, but not as he remembered her. Her hair was moss, her eyes hollowed and sprouting mushrooms. She smiled. You found it, baby. The root of it all. Dylan screamed again. The soil accepted it, pulled him deeper. The root behind his mother grew larger, reaching toward him like a hungry limb. She opened her arms. You always belong to the hollow. He closed his eyes, forced the word no from his lips, but inside his chest, the thing growing hissed. Yes! He tore at his shirt, clawed at the budding growth. It fought back, vines lashing out, digging into his ribs, anchoring him. In desperation, he bit into it. The taste was sickly sweet, like rotted peaches. The bulb ruptured, and from inside something small and moving spilled out. A fetus, rooted, with his own face. It opened its eyes and screamed. The sound shattered the cavern. Light poured in. Reality shifted. Dylan woke up on the forest floor, gasping. The sun was out, birds chirping. The lake nearby shimmered normally. Camp Willowmere gone. A dream? A hallucination? But the roots around his ankles said otherwise. The torn, bloodied bulb in his chest confirmed it. And the final horror, etched into the dirt beside him, spelled out in bones, read, You have been watered. Dylan staggered through the underbrush, with blood crusting at the edges of his shirt, the torn remains of the root pod still clinging to his chest like an unhealed wound. Pulsing faintly beneath the gauze of his sweat-soaked hoodie, and every beat it made whispered something he didn't want to understand. The forest had changed again, subtly at first, the colors of the leaves too dark, the air too still, like sound refused to live here. And then more obviously when he stepped into a clearing and found a playground. Not a campsite, not a cabin. A full suburban playground, complete with faded monkey bars and plastic slides, sun-bleached and covered in ash. The merry-go-round creaked as though just touched. As he approached, he noticed the seesaw slowly rising and falling, despite no one being on it, and then he heard it. Laughter. But not from children. It was too deep, too wet, like someone gargling joy in a throat full of brambles. Dylan froze. The air thickened around him, and the sky dimmed as if the sun had been swallowed by a passing cloud that didn't exist. He turned, and the entire forest was gone. Or rather, the trees had changed. Instead of bark and branches, they were now made of hair and teeth and bone, pulsing softly like lungs, and the ground squelched underfoot like he was walking across the back of something alive. The laughter came again, and now he could place it. It was his own, but twisted, slowed down, layered with dozens of other versions of himself. He ran, through the playground, past a plastic swing that spun wildly on its own, faster than any wind could turn it. He passed a sandbox only to see dozens of hands sticking out of the sand like roots, fingers twitching, reaching for him as he sprinted by. A slide now dripped blood steadily, like a vein had been slit at the top. And then the laughter stopped. Just like that. A silence so violent it felt like a slap. Dylan slowed down. His heart pounded, louder than it should. He was now at the edge of the playground, and beyond that, the forest resumed. But now it was covered in fog so thick he could barely see his hands. A shape emerged through it, human-sized, limping, closer, closer still. Dylan backed up, hand instinctively going to his pocket where the flare gun had been. But it was gone. So was his backpack. The fog pulled it from him like everything else. The shape emerged fully now. It was Rachel, the real Rachel. Her eyes wild with panic, her skin bruised and scraped, hair tangled with leaves and dried blood. She grabbed his shoulders. "You saw it, didn't you? The root. It touched you." He couldn't speak. She looked down and saw the bloody bud on his chest. "It's in you," she whispered, stepping back. "You need to burn it out before it blooms." Dylan grabbed her wrist. "What the hell is this place? What happened to you? I saw you. Something wearing your face." Rachel shook her head. "That wasn't me. Not really. I got away from it, barely. But it can copy us, Dylan. It grows what it eats. Memories, fears, habits. Once it roots inside, it remembers everything you've forgotten. Even things you never knew you saw. That's how it gets stronger." Dylan's mouth went dry. "What is it?" She hesitated. "They call it the seed that remembers. It's not a creature. It's not a god. It's a memory too old to die, so it lives in anything that grows. This forest, it's not haunted. It's possessed by something ancient and starving." The ground beneath them trembled gently. Rachel looked around. "We need to go. It's waking again." They ran. Not toward escape. They both knew there was none. But toward the only place Rachel said might help. A burnt ranger's tower deep in the northern woods. "There was a man once," she said between breaths. "He studied this place. Said it followed patterns. Said there were cycles to the blooming. He tried to kill the root." Dylan narrowed his eyes. "Did it work?" She didn't answer, which meant no. They reached the ridge just before sunset. The tower was a charred skeleton of iron and wood, wrapped in vines that recoiled when Rachel touched them with a flare she'd found earlier. Inside, they discovered what was left of the man, a skeleton seated at a desk, a revolver near his feet, and walls covered in maps, notes, journal entries written in frantic, desperate scrawl. One phrase repeated everywhere: "The root remembers. The forest forgives nothing." Dylan flipped through the notebook, its pages stained with dried blood. One entry stood out. "Don't burn the seed. Bury it where memory dies. In the hollow beneath the old church. It can't feed on what's forgotten." Rachel nodded. "The church is real. Abandoned in 1943 after a landslide. It's beneath the hollow cliffs. That's where we go next." Dylan looked down at the bulb in his chest. It had grown. Tiny veins now crawled up his neck like vines reaching for sunlight. His thoughts were less his own now. He heard singing, a child's lullaby in a voice he didn't recognize. He didn't tell Rachel. They needed each other. For now. That night, as they slept inside the ruined tower, the forest crept closer. Roots slithered like worms across the floor. In his dreams, Dylan stood before a congregation of faceless people. They wore masks made of bark and whispered in unison, "Let the boy bloom." He awoke choking. Rachel was gone, the flare gun missing, the maps torn from the walls. In the center of the tower floor, the spiral symbol had appeared again, etched in sap and crawling with centipedes. A voice echoed from below the tower, from the soil itself. "You were never alone in here." Dylan backed into a corner as the air thickened, the spiral glowing faintly green. The floorboards groaned, then cracked, then split, revealing not darkness, but a tunnel of roots leading downward, pulsing and wet, like a throat waiting to swallow him whole. And from its depths came Rachel's voice, or at least something wearing her voice. "Dylan, come see what memory forgot." And then the root in his chest answered with a voice of its own. "Go." Dylan didn't remember making the decision to crawl into the root tunnel, but there he was, elbows grinding against wet pulp, knees slipping on veins that pulsed beneath him, his breath loud in the silence as the earth swallowed him inch by inch, every root brushing his skin like fingers, testing his temperature. The light from above faded quickly, and soon he was surrounded only by the bioluminescent green glow of the pulsing veins in the walls. They throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Or maybe his heart was thumping in rhythm with them. It was hard to tell anymore. The tunnel seemed alive, its walls breathing around him, expanding and contracting like a sleeping lung, exhaling a hot, fungal sweet odor that clung to his tongue. As he crawled deeper, he began hearing whispers again, this time not external, but inside his head, as if the root in his chest was translating the voice of the forest directly into thought. It spoke in memories, his first nightmare, the time he thought his mother would never come back from the hospital, the exact sound his childhood dog made when it died, things he had long forgotten or forced himself to. The deeper he went, the more the tunnel changed. What had been gnarled roots became wood slats, rotted and worm-eaten, as if he were now inside a buried house. Picture frames were embedded in the wall, each one containing a photograph of him, but aged, wrong, impossible. In one, he was a man in a suit shaking hands with a faceless child. In another, he was elderly, crying blood at a funeral where all the mourners wore bark. The tunnel twisted sharply and he dropped into a new chamber, cavernous and glowing. The walls here were smoother, the color of bruised flesh. At the center stood Rachel, or the thing that wore Rachel's shape. Its smile stretched too far, its eyes not blinking. She stepped toward him, barefoot, leaving bloody footprints on the ground. "Dylan," she cooed, "you've made it to the heart. Isn't it beautiful?" Behind her, the walls rippled and then bulged as something massive moved just beyond the surface. Dylan backed away. "Where's the real Rachel?" Her smile flickered, like a video glitch. "She's still growing. You will too, once the seed finishes its work." He looked down. The root in his chest had begun pushing through his skin, forming tiny shoots that reached for the tunnel walls, eager to merge. "No," he whispered, "I won't let it." He turned and ran, taking another branching tunnel, this one narrower and colder. The whispers grew angry, louder, in a language he didn't know but understood all the same. It was the voice of loss, of grief weaponized. He stumbled into another chamber, this one filled with rusted playground equipment, the same set from the clearing. But here everything was reversed as if mirrored. The merry-go-round spun counterclockwise. The seesaw bucked violently with no one on it. On the swings hanging upside down were dozens of bodies, children, not alive, all of them missing their eyes. Dylan dropped to his knees and vomited. The root inside him pulsed joyfully. "Feed us," it said. "Remember for us." He crawled out of the chamber and into another corridor where the temperature plummeted. Ice formed on the roots. The whispers dulled, replaced by a deep humming, mechanical, rhythmic, metallic. He followed it until he emerged in what looked like a sunken church. Roof collapsed, pews rotted, but with a massive altar at the center. On it lay Rachel, real this time, breathing shallowly, barely conscious. Her skin was pale and vines had wrapped around her wrists and ankles like restraints. Dylan rushed forward, trying to pull the vines free, but they tightened, cutting into her skin. "Don't," she gasped. "It's part of the trap. It feeds off the rescue attempt. If you try to save me, it gets stronger." He stopped. His hands trembled. "What do I do?" She pointed weakly toward the altar's base. "There's a memory stone, a root shard. Burn it. Forget what it shows you." Dylan found it, a jagged black stone, glowing faintly. When he touched it, visions slammed into his skull. Rachel's past, her first time in the forest, her deal with the thing in the roots, her betrayal. She had once tried to lead a search party here. All of them promised safety in exchange for letting the root taste one of their minds. Only Dylan had survived. He dropped the stone like it had burned him. "You brought us here," he hissed. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I thought I could control it, but it's older than sin." Dylan ignited the flare gun, found beside her on the altar, and fired directly into the root shard. It exploded in a shriek of light and smoke. The entire chamber groaned. Roots recoiled. The vines around Rachel burned away. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing. "We broke the memory lock. The forest grip is weakening." But the walls began to crumble. The church was sinking. They climbed, slipping on debris, roots slashing at their legs like angry serpents. They burst through the ceiling into open forest. It was dawn. The fog was gone. Birds chirped like nothing had ever happened. Dylan looked down. The root in his chest was gone. Just a scar now. Rachel, however, had a small sprout curling from her shoulder. She hid it quickly, smiling. "We made it," she said, but her eyes were too wide, too bright. Dylan nodded slowly, unsure. In the trees behind them, something shifted. Something big. Watching, waiting. The forest was still, but it was not empty. Not anymore. They walked in silence through the forest that looked unchanged, as if all the horror had been a shared hallucination. A fever dream induced by mold or madness or something older. But Dylan knew better. He could feel it in the way the birds fell silent whenever Rachel stepped too close to a tree, in the way the shadows twisted slightly away from her when she passed. There was something off in the air, a vibration that pulsed just below the range of sound, like the world had developed a second heartbeat. Dylan had seen too much to mistake survival for escape. They hiked for hours in the direction Dylan thought would lead them back to the ranger station, but the landmarks were subtly wrong. Trees shaped like question marks, moss growing in perfect spirals, insects flying backward. At midday, they found a clearing with 3 tents, abandoned but fresh, like someone had just stepped away to get water. A pot of coffee steamed on a makeshift stove. The smell was comforting and deeply wrong. Rachel hesitated at the edge of the clearing, her hand twitching. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. "This is a false echo. The forest is looping memories again." Dylan reached out and grabbed her hand. "If it's fake, it'll break when we push through." They stepped into the clearing together. The air changed instantly. The sky dimmed, shadows lengthened, and the tents moved. They didn't collapse. They shifted, like something inside them was adjusting itself. A zipper slowly unzipped on its own. Rachel turned and ran. Dylan followed. Behind them, the clearing screamed, not with a mouth, but with roots ripping from the ground, dragging the tents into a spiral pit that hadn't been there seconds ago. They sprinted until the screaming stopped and the light returned. Rachel collapsed beside a fallen log, panting, her arm scratched bloody. Dylan knelt beside her. "You said we were free." Rachel looked up, shame flickering behind her eyes. "We broke one lock. There are more. It's trying to find a way back into you, through me." Dylan saw it then, her veins glowing faintly under the skin, and the way the small sprout on her shoulder had grown longer, now curling slightly like a hand ready to grip. "How much time do we have?" he asked. She didn't answer. That night they made camp inside a narrow crevice between 2 cliffs. Dylan tried to sleep, but the forest hummed louder in the dark. Rachel sat watch, her eyes unblinking, her body stiff. When he woke, she was gone. Panic clenched his stomach. He followed broken branches and faint footprints to a slope leading into a gully. Rachel was there, on her knees, whispering to a tree. "No, whispering to something inside the tree. The bark had split open, revealing what looked like a mouth lined with moss and thorns, and it pulsed as if breathing. Dylan shouted her name. She spun, startled. Her face was blank for a moment before recognition returned. "I'm sorry," she said. "It speaks in dreams. It shows me things." Dylan dragged her away from the tree, but part of her resisted. Her feet left long grooves in the mud. That night, he tied her hands while she slept. Not out of cruelty, but because he saw how the seed was growing. The sprout now had leaves, and they twitched in her sleep. She mumbled things he didn't want to hear. The seed remembers. The seed remembers. On the third day they found the river. It should have been salvation, a sign they were near the edge of the forest. But it flowed the wrong way, uphill and silently. No sound of water at all. In its reflection, Dylan saw not himself, but a hollow version, black eyes, a grin too wide. He backed away. Rachel stared at her own reflection, and it reached out to her from the water. A hand. Real. Wet. She screamed. Dylan tackled her as the hand splashed upward, grasping at air. It dissolved into mist. The river vanished with it. Just dirt remained. "This place is rewriting physics," he muttered. Rachel looked dazed. "It's not rewriting. It's remembering the world before physics, before rules." That night she stopped speaking, just stared into the fire. Dylan watched the leaves on her shoulder unfurl. Now they whispered too, tiny voices, begging, laughing, chanting. On the fifth day, Rachel led him to something he didn't expect. A house, a log cabin, old and crumbling, overgrown with vines, but real. Smoke puffed from the chimney. They approached cautiously. Inside, a man sat in a rocking chair, sharpening a knife. His skin was bark. His eyes were green. "You brought the seed," he said, smiling at Rachel. "She's bloomed nicely." Dylan raised a rock. "Get away from her." The man stood slowly. "I was like you once, fighting it, but it's not a parasite. It's an invitation. It shows you what the world forgot." "You mean death?" Dylan snarled. "No," the bark man said, grinning wider. "I mean before death. The truth beneath time, where memory is God." Rachel stepped forward, and Dylan saw something had changed. Her legs had roots instead of toes. She was no longer blinking. "I remember everything," she said softly. "I remember the soil that fed the first thought, the scream that birthed the moon, the hunger before language." Dylan ran. He didn't know how long. Time bent. Shadows chased him. When he collapsed, it was morning again. A real morning. The forest was quiet, normal. Birds chirped. He stumbled toward the ranger station and found it. Burned, hollowed, but real. Inside a mirror. He looked. The root in his chest was gone, but a small black bud had grown behind his left ear. He hadn't felt it. He hadn't known. He turned. Rachel stood at the tree line, still smiling. "You'll come back," she said. "They always do. The seed just sleeps. But it remembers you, and one day, it'll bloom." The ranger station had long since burned to ash, but something about the space still held memory. The air thick with the char of forgotten screams and time's bitter residue. Dylan stood amidst the charred debris, his fingers trembling against the cold frame of a scorched window, his reflection twitching slightly out of sync in the shattered glass. The bud behind his ear pulsed softly, as if sensing its name being spoken in the wind. Rachel was gone. No footsteps, no sound of leaves disturbed, just the lingering memory of her voice. "The seed remembers you." He didn't want to remember her like this. Not twisted, not speaking in riddles whispered by roots older than language. He turned from the ruins and walked north, guided only by instinct and a sickening sense that the forest had not finished with him. The path was different. Trees leaned inward, forming natural arches, limbs woven like ribs, and the sky overhead flickered between gray and orange, like an ember stuttering in the wind. The deeper he walked, the quieter everything became. The birds didn't flee anymore. They watched, still, silent, judging. Dylan stumbled across a campsite, this one fresher than the last, with backpacks, shoes, and a steaming bowl of soup resting atop a fire that didn't burn. The flames moved but cast no heat, no smoke. The air smelled of damp fur and rot. "Hello?" he called out. No response, just the sudden awareness that he was being watched. He turned slowly. The trees behind him were different. Eyes blinked open in the bark, dozens of them, all focused on him. Then one tree exhaled, a gust of wind, sour and warm, carrying the faintest whisper, "Join us." Dylan ran, but the forest twisted again. The trail behind him snapped shut like a wound, healing in reverse. Ahead, the trees thinned into a grove of white pines, their trunks unnaturally pale, almost glowing. In the center stood a monolith, a slab of stone, wet with black moss, carved with symbols he didn't understand but somehow recognized. He stepped forward, and the bud behind his ear pulsed harder, like a heartbeat aligning with something ancient. The slab hummed. "Dylan," a voice whispered, not Rachel's, not his own. It was deeper, rougher, like roots grinding stone. He touched the monolith. Visions erupted behind his eyes. Rachel crawling into the mouth of a tree. A man with no skin laughing in a pit of bones. Children with bark for skin holding hands in a ring around something black and wet and breathing. He fell backward, gasping. The monolith cracked down the middle, bleeding sap as thick as tar. From its core stepped a figure, tall, robed in bark and woven vines, its face a tangle of thorns. Its voice sounded like Rachel, but too many tones echoed beneath it. "You left the door open," it said. "Now the forest remembers the shape of man." Dylan scrambled back, tripping over roots that weren't there moments ago. "What are you?" The figure tilted its head. "We are what you buried beneath cities. We are the old pact. You were never meant to forget." It stepped closer, leaving no footprints. "Rachel is one of us now. She sings the old songs. She planted you, and now you flower." Dylan screamed as the bud behind his ear burst open, releasing not pain, but memory. He saw Rachel as a child, standing at the edge of Black Hollow Forest with her mother, before the fire, before the disappearances. He saw the roots marking her even then. He saw himself, not lost in the woods as an adult, but playing near a fallen log when he was 10, whispering to something that whispered back. The forest hadn't taken him now. It had waited, cultivated. "You were grown to be the vessel," the figure said. "The echo-born. Memory made flesh." Dylan staggered to his feet. I'm not part of this." The forest groaned. The trees shifted. The roots pulled free of soil like veins from skin. "You already are." The figure raised its hand. From the ground rose dozens of shapes, echoes of people. Some wore ranger uniforms. Some were hikers. Some were children. All had bark-covered skin and hollow, echoing eyes. "They sang before you. Now they sing through you." Dylan backed away, tears mixing with sweat. "I'll burn this whole place. I'll end it." The figure smiled. "You can't kill memory, but you can join it." A root slithered from the ground and coiled around his ankle. He kicked it free and ran, blind, desperate, toward the sound of rushing water. A real river, not silent, not backward, flowing loud and wild. He leapt from a ridge and crashed into the current, letting it drag him away. The last thing he saw before the trees swallowed the sky was Rachel standing at the edge, her eyes glowing green, a crown of leaves growing from her scalp. She didn't chase him. She only smiled. The river spat him out miles downstream. He crawled to the bank, vomiting mud and blood. He lay there for hours or days. Time had broken somewhere back in the grove. When he could stand, he found a road, a sign. Black Hollow, 32 miles. He hitchhiked in silence, ignoring the driver's questions. He said he was a camper. Just got turned around. Happens all the time. The driver laughed, nodded, told him there were stories about that place. Ghosts, missing people, bad juju. Dylan forced a smile. "Just stories." But that night, in the motel room, when he washed his face and looked in the mirror, his eyes reflected trees that weren't there. And in the silence of the air conditioner, he heard the whisper again. "You are the echo now." The motel room was suffocating, despite the air conditioning, humming like a dying animal in the window frame. Dylan sat on the bed, wrapped in a damp towel, staring at the television, which played static though it wasn't plugged in. The mirror across the room had been covered with a cheap painting of a lighthouse, but he could still see himself in the reflection of the TV screen. His eyes flickering with green every time he blinked, like something behind them was testing the surface. He hadn't slept in 2 nights, not since the forest, not since Rachel, not since he had become different. He didn't bleed anymore, he noticed. The scratch on his shoulder, which had been deep and angry from the rocks by the river, had closed completely, leaving behind a faint swirl, like a ring in a tree trunk. And the dreams were back. No, not dreams. Memories. Someone else's memories. He saw a woman in 1922 being pulled into the soil as her children screamed. A hunter in 1957 who buried something glowing in the forest floor and whispered to it each night. A family of 5 who built their cabin too deep, who were still inside the roots beneath their fireplace, eyes open and hungry. And through it all, the figure, the echo being, watching, walking, weaving its vines into every timeline like a gardener with no calendar. Dylan had to know more, had to understand what he'd been turned into, because if he couldn't stop it, maybe he could slow it. He looked at the map he'd stolen from the ranger's station ruins. It wasn't the trail map. It was older, worn, almost hand-drawn, and it showed more than paths. It showed glyphs, circles with dots, stars with roots beneath them, and a name circled 3 times, Ashcroft. It was a town to the west, right outside the border of the national forest, a forgotten town. Not on any phone map, but still there. He hitched another ride with a farmer who smelled of smoke and wet corn, and as they neared Ashcroft, the woods on either side of the road pressed in tighter. The sun disappeared for full minutes at a time. And the birds, they didn't sing. The man dropped him at the edge of town and said nothing, just stared, drove away without even closing his door. Ashcroft looked normal. That was the first warning. Too normal. American flags on porches, white fences, the scent of bread and rain. But no children, no dogs, no cars in driveways. As Dylan walked the cracked sidewalk, eyes peeked through curtains. The store signs were faded but intact. Granger's Pharmacy, Tilly's Groceries, Welcome to Ashcroft, established, 1841. He walked into the diner. The bell rang. Every head turned toward him. No one blinked. Then they all returned to their food as one, chewing in perfect sync. The waitress approached without speaking. She poured black coffee into a chipped mug and placed a menu in front of him. He didn't touch it. "I'm looking for information about Black Hollow Forest," he said. Her hand tightened on the coffee pot. "That place ain't real," she said without looking at him. "Just a patch of trees where folks get stupid." "Rachel Mark," he said. "She came through here last month." Silence fell over the diner like a dropped curtain. The air went still. Every patron turned their head toward him again, this time slower, deliberate. The waitress leaned close. "You should go now." "I can't," he said. "Something followed me out. Something's growing." He pulled his sleeve up, revealing the mark on his shoulder. The waitress dropped the pot. Glass shattered. Coffee hissed. "You brought it here," a man said from the booth. His voice was not angry, it was reverent. "After all these years." The others stood. Not fast, not threatening. Just stood. A ritual. Dylan backed toward the door. "What is this town?" The waitress smiled now, teeth too perfect. "We're the mulch that keeps it fed. We plant what walks out. We bury what gets too loud." He ran. Out the door, past the market, into the alley. But the streets behind him were different now. Longer, tilted. The shadows stretched against logic. He burst into a church. It smelled like wet iron and pine. A priest stood at the pulpit, head bowed, holding a book with no title. "Forgive me," Dylan gasped. "I didn't mean to." "You are not the first echo," the priest said, lifting his eyes. They were root black. "But you are the first that might choose." "Choose what?" "To bury it or to let it bloom." Behind the altar was a trap door. The priest opened it. Below, stairs led down into the dark. "They brought you here for the offering, but it is not too late to descend. The deeper you go, the truer you become." "And if I don't?" The priest blinked slowly. "The town will plant you anyway." Dylan descended. The air turned wet, warm. The walls of the tunnel were not stone, but bone. Fossilized ribs knotted with veins. The deeper he went, the louder the whisper became. Not words, just sensation, hunger, memory, expectation. The stairs ended in a chamber, pulsing with a green glow. In the center was a tree, not tall but thick, its bark moving like muscle, its roots wrapped around the skeletons of animals, people, children, and beneath the roots, something alive, breathing, watching. Rachel knelt before it, her head shaved, her skin etched with glowing glyphs. "You came," she whispered. "You followed the seed." Dylan stepped forward, shaking. "What is this? What did they do to you?" "They didn't do anything," she said, rising. "They woke me, just like they're waking you." She stepped aside. The tree opened, literally peeled apart, revealing a black hole in the center filled with pulsing light and memory. "Go in," she said. "Remember what we are." Dylan stared into the opening. Inside, he saw every version of himself: child, teenager, ranger, lost soul, standing in different forests, touching trees that touched back. He saw futures where he walked the woods with eyes full of moss, where he became the thing that whispered to lost hikers and dragged them down. "If I go in, I lose myself," he said. Rachel stepped closer. "Number you become yourself." The roots behind him shifted. The chamber was closing. The town had started the offering. Either he entered willingly or was fed to the soil anyway. He looked at her one last time. "Will it hurt?" "Only at first," she said. And then she smiled, and her teeth were leaves. He stepped into the hollow. The sensation of falling was not like falling through air, but like being swallowed by something ancient and breathing. Dylan was aware of every cell in his body being stretched, rewritten, unstitched, and resewn with thread made of memory and sap. There was no time down here, only sensation and whispers. And the whispers did not come from without, but from within. They spoke in his mother's voice, in Rachel's laughter, in the scream of the boy he once found drowned in a creek in Black Hollow 6 years ago. He saw trees with veins, their bark peeled back to reveal skin. He saw his own hands planting a child's shoe in the soil and watering it with tears. And then he stopped. Not physically, he wasn't moving, but he stopped becoming. In that moment, he existed in two states: the man he had been and the thing he was about to become. And then something blinked. Not eyes. Not in the traditional sense. But the forest blinked. It acknowledged him. And it asked a question. Not in words, but in feeling. "Do you accept this route?" Dylan tried to speak but had no mouth. He thought of Rachel, of the town of Ashcroft, of the altar, of the glyphs, of the priest. He thought of fire. Fire had always stopped the spread of roots. He had once set a brush fire by accident as a kid and remembered how the smoke seemed to choke the trees into silence. That thought caused a ripple. The forest recoiled slightly, and in that recoil, he felt breath again. Lungs again. Pain. Real pain. He opened his eyes and found himself not in a glowing cavern anymore, but standing in a forest that felt wrong, too symmetrical. The trees were perfectly spaced. The ground was dry despite the rain falling hard from a sky too bright, and the silence was pure, not natural. Rachel was gone. He turned and saw a figure watching him from behind a tree. It wore ranger clothes but had no face, just a knot of bark shaped like a scream. It pointed at his chest. Dylan looked down and saw a symbol burned into his shirt, into his skin, a spiral with thorns. Suddenly he understood. He was no longer inside the offering. He was in the after, a place between seed and bloom, a place where the chosen walked until they chose their purpose. And the town of Ashcroft, it hadn't just been a community. It was a nursery. Every few years it birthed one of these echoes, souls caught between human and forest. Dylan had become one, but his path was broken. Something had interrupted it. Maybe his doubt, maybe the fire in his memory. The figure stepped closer. Dylan asked, "What do you want?" The figure raised its hand and held out something. A tooth. His. From his childhood. It had moss on the root. Dylan took it. And in that moment, he saw everything. Generations of offerings. Children stolen from camps. Tourists lured into trails that didn't exist. The forest taking their fear, planting it, growing new roots from old guilt. The echoes were not monsters. They were gardeners. But Dylan had not fully accepted. He had resisted, and that made him a flaw. The forest did not allow flaws. A deep moaning shook the trees. The sky flickered like a broken screen. The ground cracked, and from the earth rose something huge. A tree made of mouths. Hundreds of open mouths screaming in silence. It dragged itself forward with roots like tentacles. The judge, the devourer of false echoes. Dylan ran. The forest folded around him. Branches reached like claws but never touched. They didn't want to stop him. They wanted to guide him. Towards something. Towards someone. A cabin appeared in the clearing, old and rotted, but the chimney smoked and the door creaked open just as he reached it. Inside was a single lantern, and beneath it a man, alive, chained to the floor. "Help me," the man whispered. "They said I had to stay until another came." "Who are you?" Dylan asked. "You brought the tree out," the man said. "You let it see again." Dylan realized this man was one of the first echoes, an unfinished one who refused the root completely. "Why did they spare you?" "They didn't," the man said. "They just needed someone to hold the memory until the next seed cracked." He looked into Dylan's eyes. "You're the next seed." The cabin shuddered. The devourer was near. Dylan looked at the man. "What do I do?" The man smiled. "You finish what I never could." Dylan turned and lit the cabin on fire. Not with matches, with his own breath, with the memory of fire. The flames erupted instantly, not natural, holy, purifying. The screams came not from the man but from the roots beneath the floor, burning, shriveling. The judge screamed too, just outside. Dylan ran again. The air was changing. He could see through the trees. Not just the trees here, but all trees. Every forest he had ever walked. He saw campers sleeping under pines, unaware of what grew beneath them. He saw trails shifting to lure wanderers. He saw the truth. The roots connected them all. Every forest was one organism, and Dylan was now its nerve ending. He reached the river, the one he and Rachel had followed so long ago. Except it wasn't water anymore. It was sap, thick, sweet, and red. Rachel stood on the other side. "You've almost chosen," she said. "You can't go back, only forward." "I want to burn it all," Dylan said. "Then be fire," Rachel said, vanishing into the mist. Dylan stepped into the sap. It burned, but he didn't scream. It welcomed him now. Not as food, as something else, as change. And as he sank beneath, the forest above sighed. Something ancient shifted, and in the town of Ashcroft, every door opened at once. The offering was no longer needed. The forest had grown its own fire. The sap consumed him whole, thick and sentient, like it had been waiting not just for him, but for something within him that even he hadn't known existed. Dylan wasn't drowning. He was dissolving, his skin turning to memory, his bones to sound, his thoughts scattering like dry leaves in a hurricane of whispers. He felt the voices of every missing soul, the screams never heard, the prayers swallowed by moss. Then silence, a void so deep it rang. He existed there for what felt like centuries, not alone but watched, judged not by gods or men, but by the root-born intelligences of the forest, old as myth and hungry as grief. A question echoed through the dark. Will you bloom, or will you burn? He answered not with words but with intention, with flame. Deep inside he held on to the ember, the one spark of refusal that had survived the ritual, the glyphs, the dream tree of mouths. And that spark answered for him. Suddenly the void screamed, and the sap rejected him. He was spat out of the forest floor like bile, coughing up blood and bark, gasping in a clearing unfamiliar, where the moon was red and pulsing like a heartbeat. Before him stood Rachel, but not the Rachel he had known. This version wore a dress woven from pine needles and thorns. Her eyes were black voids threaded with green veins. She spoke with the voices of many. You cannot reject the bloom and survive. You are the first to try. Dylan staggered up, weak but defiant. Then I'll be the last, he hissed. The offering ends with me. Rachel tilted her head. It was never about you. You are just the crack in the bark. Through you, the fire dreams. The earth quaked. The trees around them twisted, bark peeling back to reveal twisted humanoid shapes beneath. Previous echoes, failed seeds, aborted roots. They screamed as one, creating a resonance that tore at Dylan's ears and mine. But he didn't run. He walked forward, hand trembling, reaching into his shirt, pulling out the ancient tooth the faceless ranger had given him. He stabbed it into the ground. Instantly, the soil sizzled. Roots snapped. The clearing shrieked like a wounded animal. Dylan dropped to his knees, but he kept pressing, driving that rotten piece of his childhood deep into the very flesh of the forest. The world bent. The sky split open, and from it poured fire. Not ordinary fire, but something ancient and righteous. It danced without wind, spread without fuel, burned only what remembered. The malformed echoes tried to flee, but the fire chased them through the trees, across trails into memories. Rachel screamed and transformed into something root-wrapped and screaming, her limbs fracturing into branches. "You were supposed to forget," she howled. "We made you forget." But Dylan remembered now. Everything. The day he wandered too far from the campsite as a child. The shadow he saw move against the trees. The hand that touched his shoulder but left no mark. The voice that told him to look away as another boy, his cousin, was taken. He had lived with guilt his whole life, never knowing why. Now he did. He hadn't just survived Black Hollow. He'd been marked by it, groomed for this, not to feed the roots but to destroy them. The fire grew. It fed on guilt, not timber. The forest began to scream in earnest, thousands of voices crying out through the leaves, the soil, the wind. Dylan rose, and the flames didn't touch him. They bowed around him. Behind him, the devourer, the tree of mouths, burst through the ridge in one final attempt to consume the flame-bearer. But Dylan didn't flinch. He turned and stared into its howling hunger and whispered a name. Not his own, not Rachel's, but the name of the first child ever taken. A name the forest had tried to bury. "Avery," he said. "I bring him back." The devourer convulsed, its mouths melting into black sap. It fell, cracking the earth, and from its trunk, a light poured out. A figure crawled free, a small boy, eyes wide, face dirty but human. Alive. Avery. Dylan took his hand. The fire didn't burn the child either. It embraced him. The forest fell silent. Trees stopped swaying. Roots pulled back like severed limbs. Dylan and Avery stood in the center of the inferno, untouched, unbroken. In that stillness, Dylan heard one final whisper, not from the forest, but from within. The fire remembers. So must you. And then he collapsed. When he awoke, the forest was gone. Not burned, gone. Nothing remained but ash and a circle of stone where the town of Ashcroft had once stood. No buildings, no roads, no sign it had ever existed. Only him, Avery, and the memory, and a trail, newly formed, lined with blackened trees and glowing embers. A trail that led out. But as he stood, he realized he wasn't alone. Others had emerged, dozens, survivors, campers once lost, hikers thought dead, all freed by the fire's judgment, and they looked to him not as a savior, but as the one who ended the cycle. Dylan took Avery's hand and stepped onto the trail. Behind them, the ash blew upward into the shape of a root, and then crumbled. Ahead, the path waited. But deep beneath, something still stirred. Because even in death, forests dream, and sometimes those dreams burn. They walked for hours. No sun marked the sky above. Only an eternal twilight choked in gray, as if the world itself held its breath. Behind them, the place where Black Hollow had once thrived was now nothing more than a crater of memory. A pit rimmed by scorched symbols burned into the soil, smoldering with faint orange veins. Dylan didn't speak. Neither did Avery. The boy's grip was tight but not fearful. Survivors followed at a distance, wary, broken, uncertain if they had escaped or simply moved into a quieter layer of the nightmare. The trail wound onward, but the world was wrong. Birds did not sing. No insects chirped. Trees lined the path in unnatural symmetry, their branches curled upward like skeletal hands in prayer or surrender. Every so often, a survivor would vanish. No sound, no cry, just gone, as if the forest had blinked and forgotten them. Dylan noticed but said nothing. He understood now. Not all who had returned were meant to stay. Some had been too far gone, fused too deeply with the root dream. And this path, this wasn't an exit. It was a judgment. The forest had burned, but its sentience remained scattered in the very ash they inhaled. It tested them still. Avery tugged his hand and pointed. A figure waited ahead, standing where the trail forked. It was the faceless ranger, but this time he had a face, and it was Dylan's. Older, scarred, eyes hollow. The ranger smiled without joy. "You think it ends here?" he asked, voice soft like dead leaves. "You burned the forest, yes, but you never asked who planted it." Dylan felt a chill crackle through his ribs. "What do you mean?" The ranger gestured to the fork. "One path returns you to the world, but it carries memory, and memory calls to them. Walk it, and you become the next route, the new beginning." Dylan glanced at the other path. It was darker, narrower, but pulsing with faint light beneath the soil, like veins. "That one?" he asked. "Oblivion," the ranger said. "You walk it, and everything ends. You, them, the story, the watchers beyond the bark, the blood in the trees, all of it. No rebirth, no hunger, just silence." Avery looked up at Dylan, eyes wide. "I'm scared," he whispered. Dylan crouched. "So am I." And in that moment, Dylan realized something horrifying. The forest hadn't just chosen him to end it. It had tested him to replace it. The devourer, the dream tree, the rituals. They weren't random. They were inheritance. And Dylan had passed. That's why the fire had spared him. Not because he had resisted, but because he was strong enough to continue. He could walk the path of memory, rebuild the root, wear bark instead of skin, become the next whisper. And he almost wanted to make the pain mean something, to protect Avery by becoming the next guardian. But then he remembered Rachel's final scream. "You were supposed to forget." Forgetting was the curse. Remembering was rebellion. Dylan stood and chose. He lifted Avery into his arms and turned down the narrow, light-veined path, the one that led to nothing. Oblivion. The ranger's smile faltered. "You'll never come back," he warned. Dylan didn't reply. He walked. And behind him, one by one, the remaining survivors followed. None spoke. None questioned. They had all seen too much, felt too deeply. The trail narrowed, light pulsing brighter with every step. Trees thinned. The ground grew soft. Then the final moment came. A wall of white mist like breath held for eternity. Dylan stepped into it. There was no pain, no sound. Only the purest stillness he had ever known. And then, nothing. Not even memory. Just the end. Back in the crater where Black Hollow had been, the ash swirled. The earth trembled slightly, and somewhere, far from the forest, a new tree sprouted in the center of a suburban backyard. A single black root pierced the lawn. A child playing nearby paused, turning to look at it, tilting his head. Behind him, the wind whispered through invisible leaves, and deep in the soil, something smiled.